Hey all, this video isn't quite what I expected to be making right now, but I suppose it stays on topic with the whole fandom discourse theme I had going on last time, so I'll keep it up. So, Dragon Ball Sparking Zero releases. Huge deal. Budokai Tenkaichi 4 has been a meme in the Dragon Ball fandom for like a decade. This was our Half-Life 3. And because it made such a ruckus leading up to release, it caught a lot of outside attention. People were interested in seeing what all the commotion was about, which led to people outside the fandom trying the game, which is a great thing. It's awesome to see the game get a larger scope than just Dragon Ball fans or the FGC. It also led to a pretty interesting exposure of certain flaws in Sparking Zero that may not be super evident to Dragon Ball fans. And a video made by videogamedunkey is both a great example of those flaws and, in my opinion, a great way of portraying them poorly. Now, I didn't start this video off with a do not harass Dunkey disclaimer, mostly because I trust you all to be reasonable, and because I don't have an audience, and because I'm actually going to agree with some of the points made in his video, but I do want to make it explicitly clear that if you do harass Dunkey, I'm legally obligated to report you to a trusted adult. So, videogamedunkey made a video about Sparking Zero. It's not a review, so it's mostly meant to be a joke video from what I can tell, but he did make some legitimate points against the game that I will be addressing, disputing, and then sort of explaining how I would portray them to actually make a point about the game that's fairly constructive, as opposed to just proposing that Sparking Zero should have been a completely different video game. One of the first points he makes is about the sheer number of Gokus in this game, and how it's difficult to differentiate them. All the base Gokus look the same, Super Saiyan looks like Super Saiyan 2, it's a lot of samey looking characters. To Dragon Ball fans, this is a huge draw to the game. Not only do you get to play as your favorite characters, a lot of them have different arcs to choose from. You can play as specifically Saiyan Saga Goku or specifically Namek Saga Goku, and they have different moves. It's really cool. Notice how I'm not saying Dunkey is objectively wrong in his observation. As a newcomer to Dragon Ball, what distinguishes these characters is not evident from the character select screen, or even upon initially playing them. What separates Goku Mid from Goku Super is not going to be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the series, and hey! I already hear you typing over there. Yes, Sparking Zero is a game for fans of Dragon Ball, and specifically the Budokai Tenkaichi series, as well as Raging Blast and Xenoverse fans. However, that doesn't mean newcomers should feel alienated. We should want people to be able to get into the game and able to play and understand it without having too much prior context. You can make a game for fans without alienating new players, and while having multiple versions of the same character is great for allowing some variety, it looks the opposite way for new players. I think there should be an option to divide up the character select screen into individual characters, which can then open up a drop-down menu for their variations. Budokai Tenkaichi 3, this game's predecessor, actually kinda does this. The character select is organized by saga, and selecting a character will open a sub-menu to their transformations where applicable. Even if you don't prefer this, it could have at least been an option. And to Dunkey's credit, this whole Goku point is portrayed as more of a joke than anything else. I suppose I'm ranting more about a missed opportunity rather than a misrepresented point here. Something I can't say about some of the video's later points brought up against the game's story mode, but I will bring up the misrepresented point topic when talking about the actual gameplay later on.
If I found all 7 Dragon Balls, my wish would be that they had the fighting of this game with the storyline of Dragon Ball, but not skipping the whole storyline like this game.
Okay, so ignoring the context of the fact that Sparking Zero was never advertised as a story-focused game, or even a retelling of the anime, which is what DBZ Kakarot is, which came out 4 years ago, and the fact that previous Dragon Ball games, including the predecessors to Sparking Zero in the same series, get criticized for just recapping the DBZ story in painstaking detail every single time they release, claiming that Sparking Zero should have just been a game that already exists with the story of a 4.5 arc anime is so ridiculous I can't tell if it's supposed to be another joke. But given the way he refers back to DBFC multiple times and how much he prefers the game's combat, I think it's a case of there being truth in jest. Ignoring the fact that DBFC is a 2D fighter and Sparking Zero is a 3D arena fighter, something that Dunkey knows because he isn't an idiot and he makes a couple comparisons to Tekken and how much he prefers that game, again, I see where the issue comes from. At multiple points, Dunkey mentions how he doesn't get the story because a lot is skipped or told to him in text instead of shown to him. Part of this is due to how episode mode is structured. It's less of a traditional story mode, and he doesn't mention the branching paths or sparking episodes, which is a whole different can of worms that I don't have time to get into. But yeah, this is not a good way to experience the story of Dragon Ball. Again, this is a game for fans, and Kakarot is what you're looking for if you want a retelling of Z, but given that this game is one of the first of its kind to also cover the story of Super, as well as one of few to include content from GT, it would have been amazing if it could have been the ultimate recap of Dragon Ball. But I understand that's sort of out of scope for the developers that are already making a roster with this many characters and variations. Sparking Zero is massive, and its emphasis is on its multiplayer modes, pointing out how the story fails as a recap of the show, especially one that a lot of the people buying this game are already familiar with, is a non-issue for some, but it is hostile to new players, I'll admit. I do kinda wish the game had like a more in-depth encyclopedia for those who want to learn more, since the current encyclopedia just kinda gives you information on some of the characters in the game. I don't want to seem like I'm asking for too much, but I also want to establish some common ground. I want to solve a problem with Sparking Zero that I think the community overlooks, and that's the value I find in Dunkey's video. I see the points of someone unfamiliar with the series wanting to enjoy the game but finding roadblocks in their understanding, and I want to portray those points in a way that's sympathetic to the people that the game wasn't made as adequately for, rather than say the game has to equally cater to everyone. I think Dunkey's points have value. I don't think he expresses them with the weight they actually deserve, though, instead settling for sounding disappointed and cracking jokes at the game's expense. Which is odd, because in another regard, Sparking Zero's story mode is actually a pretty easy target. There's a point that's made very commonly that Dunkey doesn't really point out in his video, being the slideshow cutscenes, which are, in my opinion, a pretty massive missed opportunity. Everyone has brought these up at least once. Sparking Zero looks absolutely fantastic, especially when you consider that the cutscenes are basically done in-engine without many tricks. Why are we spending most of the story mode looking at still images and having stuff explained to us? Stuff fans of Dragon Ball already know, and new fans won't get enough out of to understand the story. But all that being said, saying Sparking Zero, a multiplayer-focused game, should have a story mode that recaps all of Dragon Ball isn't really reasonable for the game's scope prior to considering the story mode. I'm hoping that with DLC 1 we can get a more in-depth recap of Superhero, since that's a sub 2-hour movie, which is much more reasonable to adapt. Alright, so as I mentioned before, Dunkey doesn't seem to like Sparking Zero all that much, and that extends to its combat, which is fine. I could make a point about how saying Tekken makes this game look bad is a subjective point that's expressed more ambiguously, but to his credit, he says he likes FighterZ's combat more, not that he thinks it was better, so I think we can take the Tekken point with a grain of salt and assume subjectivity in that argument. Though, from the looks of things, Dunkey's gameplay is pretty surface level when it comes down to how he engages with the game's combat, which, again, actually has some interesting points under the surface. This game is a forced tutorial, but it basically teaches you nothing. The actual techniques are hidden behind the training menu, which is a somewhat clunky sub-menu with all of its teachings separated into individual lessons you have to painstakingly select and complete one by one. This is just kind of a fighting game thing. I remember Guilty Gear Strive having a similar problem, but I digress. Things like pressing different buttons to do different moves mid-combo is never even presented as a possibility in the scripted tutorial. They tell you the top face button is the blast button, but its use changes based on context, so just calling it the blast button is misleading. And the CPUs in the story mode don't really get much tougher over time, their numbers just get bigger because they get stronger characters and more enemies per battle. The story mode reinforces very simple playstyles with some bad habits and very surface level engagement with the mechanics, like another Dragon Ball fighting game I know. I know this is a common issue with arcade and story modes in fighting games, but I wish the story mode would actually teach you mechanics. Why doesn't Vegeta teach you about rush chaining? Grade 8 Vegeta could be a Beam Clash tutorial. Maybe Frieza could have a permanent minimum of one skill point and will revenge counter really often, so the fight teaches you to counter revenge counters. Fighting Buu could emphasize the different rush finishers to convert into supers. I'm spitballing, but the story mode should encourage more engagement with the game's systems than just mashing through it. Again, there are interesting points being made in Dunkey's argument, but the way he voices them doesn't really promote an actual discussion about the game. His video isn't a review, so am I maybe overanalyzing a joke video? Yeah, probably. I suppose after the initial defiant reaction to his points, I kind of felt heard with some of my complaints with Sparking Zero as a Dragon Ball fan. I wanted to sort of expand on what I heard and offer an interpretation of jokes as an actual critique of a game I otherwise enjoy, even if the video leads me to believe that Dunkey doesn't feel the same way. I want games I like to draw people in, not alienate them because they didn't play a series that hasn't gotten a new installment in over a decade, or watch the prerequisite 500 plus episodes of context and, 25 movies? 30? Most of which aren't canon? Look at FighterZ. That game actually got traction outside of the Dragon Ball fandom. Dunkey even used it as an example of a Dragon Ball fighting game he liked more. It clearly has more general appeal, probably because it was made by Arxis. I'm also not going to get into the fact that FighterZ definitely has a worse story mode, though I'm just putting this here for posterity's sake. And who knows, maybe even if the game was more accessible, Dunkey still wouldn't like it. Maybe nobody's mind would be changed. But I do still want to try and offer up some valid criticism of Sparking Zero, and maybe a little bit at Dunkey. And I'd like to talk about ways the game could have improved the player experience. Sparking Zero is a Dragon Ball fan's dream game, generally speaking, but if newcomers feel so alienated that they just end up wanting a different game, maybe the approach to certain aspects could have been handled differently. The game already has 2 control schemes, a more intuitive modern one, and one that replicates the old Budokai Tenkaichi games. So clearly there was some thought that went into this regard of Sparking Zero. I hope I presented this whole argument in a way that was digestible and not too inflammatory to either side of the Sparking Zero train. I'll be lurking in the comments if anyone wants to chat. Or argue. I'll take the engagement where I can get it. Until then, I've been River, and now I gotta go back to writing the video I already promised was in the works. See ya!